So today, let's think a little bit about defining artificial intelligence. I'm going to try that again. So today, let's ask the question, what is artificial intelligence? There's a lot of discussions about what it could and should be, but I think it's important for us to take a step back and really think about what we want to define it as in order to productively think about design in the context of intelligence. We'll start by looking at some stuff from speculative fiction, so science fiction, for those of you who enjoy it. Really thinking about what it means to actually imagine artificial intelligence, right? This is a great way of thinking about how we as humans prototype our interactions with different kinds of AI. So once we've had some time looking at that, we'll then dig into really defining artificial intelligence, ending with what I'm going to call a pragmatic definition that allows for us to really focus in on specific items when we're thinking about human computer interaction and design in the context of AI. In the 1968 book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Philip K. Dick talked about the idea of different forms of androids and the way in which they could be integrated within our society, and even some of the different ways in which they might be exploited or might have troubles, very similar to the ways in which humans have troubles in modern society. In a lot of ways, this kind of reflected a lot of the things that he was thinking about with respect to how we actually animate our environment, how our robots interact with our environment, and how we're really sort of existing in this very technological world that includes both human and artificial constructs, right? He describes this sort of man-made world of machines as one consisting of artificial constructs, computers, electronic systems, and different kinds of components, right? In a lot of ways, he was exploring this very old idea of animism, right? If we're thinking about our environment as being alive, as our robots coming to life, then what does it actually mean for something to be alive? But we've also been imagining AI in that sense for a very long time, right? So whether you're thinking about the golem or Talos, or even some of the constructs from Chinese mythology, like the terracotta army, or even the totem pole, the thunderbird on totem pole that you see in the top right. These are all different ways in which we have tried to imbue our world, our environment, our nature with meaning and with life, right? We're trying to bring the world to life as a way of trying to understand the world around it. One could argue that these are some of our earliest interactions with trying to really think a little bit about what it means to be alive and what it means for things to come to life, right? We have gone so far as to then make entire movies in which we sort of describe these complex interactions between humans and the things that we have brought to life, mostly with our minds. From there, we actually started thinking a little bit more deliberately about this concept of a robot. In the 1929 play by Karel Capek, Rossum's Universal Robots, he first introduced this concept of a robot. In this particular case, there were androids rebelling their life as forced laborers as humans decided to enslave them as part of our society, right? In that sense, we spend a lot of time actually imagining human-machine relationships. We have lots of movies in which we depict different kinds of dystopia, oftentimes with very human-like robots and human-like androids that turn against us. We fall in love with them sometimes. And we even entrust our own children to them. We have very complicated relationships with robots. Sometimes we think of them as these comedic sidekicks that we take for granted. And in other cases, we're scared of them, right? There's this projection of human emotions onto androids and robots that really, I think, reflects the inner crises of humans. This is sometimes described as this, concept of human-android emotional interaction. Let's consider again the android itself. So this is the character Data from the TV show Star Trek, The Next Generation. And Data was an android, right? He was a synthetic being that was created from different kinds of circuitry and technology. And at some point in this entire show, there is a discussion around sentience and what it means to be alive. He finds himself in an episode called The Measure of a Man, actually having to defend his own existence. Picard, his boss, in effect, has to defend him and asks the question, what is required of sentience? The cyberneticist who wants to actually dismantle Data describes these three concepts. He says, sentience is intelligence, self-awareness, and consciousness. That's really hard, though, because if that is the threshold that we're setting for sentience, then it means that we even have to be able to figure out if we are sentient and really start to grapple with some of those philosophical questions that I think we think about and have struggled about and written about throughout human history, right? What does it mean to be human, let alone what does it mean for something else or someone else to have sentience? But the thing that I find really remarkable about this particular piece of fiction is this idea of the courtroom as a crucible, where we actually start to talk about some of these ideas with respect to what it means to be human, right? Picard goes on to say, make the decisions that you want, but what the decision we make will reveal is the kind of people we are, right? What we're really doing is we're defining boundaries around personal liberty and freedom, thinking about what it means for people to be slaves or enslaved, to be engaged in servitude, what is appropriate, right? There's so many different types of considerations that we have to make, even as we're considering hypothetically the concept of sentience, that I think it's a really interesting space for us to kind of sit and reflect with respect to what we actually want, for instance, even regulation to look like as we're thinking about the context of AI. So if we go back to this sort of three-part requirements for sentience, you'll see us playing with each of these pieces in different kinds of fiction, right? In Terminator, the Terminator is both friend and foe. He saves us, but he's also a villain. It is still a robot. It is still an intelligent robot. It is a somewhat self-aware robot, but we're still not entirely sure whether or not it is a conscious being, right? The entire sort of series grapples with that idea. We've fallen in love with robots time and time again. The movie Her feels oddly relevant again in 2024, as in this particular case, a man falls in love with a disembodied voice that is in effect an operating system. So over and over again, we find ourselves asking the questions of, right, what does it mean to be intelligent? What does it mean to be self-aware? And what does it mean to be conscious? And by whose tests are we going to deem those things of being met, right? Is it our tests and our perceptions of what it means to be self-aware, or is it somebody else's? And if so, when do we decide that we're actually going to accept this concept, right? And so in a lot of ways, through science fiction, we're really exploring these ideas of what our constructs look like, right? And returning back to this idea of projecting our emotions, right? There's a lot of human-android emotional interaction that plays out in our fiction. This is a quote from a book called The Sandman, in which, again, there is a very, very feminine android at the center of it. And you can see in this quote, right, she's both this beautiful creature as well as this like very powerful thing that can capture you. She's something that you could fall in love with, but you could be terrified of, right? And so it sort of reflects our both enthusiasm and, worries, our concerns about what it means to actually create technology, engage with technology, and perhaps even be sometimes taken by our own technology. I want to close this sort of series of vignettes with another quote from Philip K. Dick. And he wrote in this article, The Android and the Human, this idea that, rather than learning about ourselves by studying our constructs, perhaps we should actually attempt to comprehend what our constructs are up to by looking at what we ourselves are up to. In a lot of ways, this is an invitation for us to not only engage with self-reflection, but also reflection on what we want our technologies to be, right? This is a movie, Blade Runner 2049, which was actually a reimagining of that Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep book. This was released in 2017. And in this particular instance, we actually witness two androids who are theoretically self-aware having a conversation about what it actually means to be like beings in this world surrounded by, as you can see, other artificial constructs, right? So reflecting on what it means for something to be artificial versus real, I think is a really interesting problem. It is an interesting philosophical concept, but sometimes it does not necessarily always play out in the physical tools that we're building in the day-to-day. So in a lot of ways, I encourage you to really think about the work that was presented so far and this sort of space of science fiction as one in which we often are prototyping human AI interactions, right? The most classic example of this comes from Isaac Asimov's Laws of Robotics. Most people who have a little bit of interest in robotics will often be able to quote the three laws, where the first law is really about the robot making sure that human beings are safe. The second law is one of obedience, where the robots are required to actually obey humans, and you can already see a conflict because then the question again arises of like, who should be obeyed? Is it you or me? And then there's this third law around, survival or self-protection, right? But we're really trying to think about different ways in which we can negotiate and manage and articulate how we want to interact with the technologies that we create, and potentially one day even the artificial intelligences that we might create.